We're a full week into Wilds of Eldraine spoilers, but we're still getting some shocking cards, like the first real 2-mana mana rock in Standard in more than a decade. Hello everyone, it's Seth, probably better known as Saffron Olive, and it's time for another daily dose of Wilds of Eldraine spoilers. So we're inching our way towards the end of spoiler season. We get the full set Friday, but today we actually have a huge spoiler day with a ton of really exciting stuff to talk about, which means we should probably jump right into it, start talking about the cards. Before we do, a couple quick reminders. First, if you need any of these cards, you can snag them from our sponsor Card Kingdom over at cardkingdom.com/MTGGoldfish. Second, to keep up on the latest previews throughout the day, you should head on over to MTGpreviews.com. And oh yeah, there were also some Commander spoilers today, and Tomer's going to cover those over on the MTG Goldfish Commander YouTube, so make sure to check out his video to see all the new Commander exclusives coming in set boosters. Anyway, let's talk some Wilds of Eldraine. First off today, we have a ridiculous new adventure creature, maybe the best run from the entire set for 60 card formats, in Mosswood Dreadnight. So it's spell side, 1 and a black, sorcery, Dread Whispers to draw a card and lose a life. Okay, 2 mana to cycle and lose a life, whatever. Creature side, 2 mana, green 3/2 human knight with trample. The important text here is when it dies, you can cast it from your graveyard as an adventure until the end of your next turn. So either side of this card is kind of okay, like a 2 mana 3/2 trampler. On curve, that's a fine 2-drop that you don't mind playing. 2 mana to cycle and lose a life at sorcery speed, a little bit expensive, but it's not horrible. The exciting part about this card is it kinda never dies. So what I'm envisioning is, you run this out on turn 2, and you get a 3/2 to start attacking with, blocking with, and then eventually it's gonna die, and then you just pay 2, draw a card, lose a life, and then you have it back in exile, so you can play the creature side again. Essentially, for 4 mana, this is draw a card, lose a life, have a 3/2. Whenever it dies. So you can sacrifice it, trades off in combat, whatever. And the most exciting part about this is it can actually block. So along with being a recursive threat, it's also a recursive defender. So if you think about what this card is, it's kind of my Iconoclast, a card that has seen some play in Standard. Like a 2 mana 3/2 is a fine stat base. And then it reminds me a little bit of Foulmire Knight, where you got this adventure, draw a card, lose a life, and then Foulmire Knight actually saw quite a bit of play back in the day. That was mostly because Edgewell Innkeeper was really, really good with adventures. We don't have an Edgewell Innkeeper this time, but I still think Dreadnight is going to be a very good card. Maybe the best comparison is actually Tenacious Underdog. We've seen Tenacious Underdog be very good in Standard as a repeatable recursive card advantage engine. It's also a 2 mana 3/2. It doesn't have trample, and then you can blitz it into play from your graveyard for 4 mana and 2 life. That actually kind of lines up with Dreadnight. Dreadnight, it's 4 mana to do the whole process. Draw a card, lose a life, put it in exile as an adventure, then cast it as a creature. The big difference is Tenacious Underdog, it only plays offense once it dies. Like the first time you play it naturally, it can play defense, but once you start blitzing it, it only lasts for a turn, so you really can only attack with it and draw a card. Mosswood Dreadnight is way better on defense. It's worse on offense because it doesn't have haste, although trample is a nice bonus, but this is a Tenacious Underdog that can actually block repeatedly. So I imagine this is going to be a very good card in Standard. The only problem is, it's a green card, and we haven't seen green be that good, but there's so much upside here. Trample means it works well with equipment and auras. It's a human, and we have human synergies in Standard. It's a knight, we have knight synergies in Standard. So it's got 2 relevant creature types, and we have some reasons to be a Golgari deck. What we've seen in Standard recently is Mono Black was really good, and then players branched out to Splash Blue to compete with the control decks, so we know that you can take the really, really strong black base and splash a second color into it and have a dominant deck. Like that's essentially where we're at in Standard right now, is the Dimir deck way at the top of the format. There's no reason you can't do that with green instead of blue, or even on top of blue if you want to, and play Mosswood Dreadnight, and I think it's going to be worth it. I think this card is so good in our grindy, slow Standard format that it could be worth considering splashing into green instead of blue. Plus you get like Glissa, Old Rustine gets way better in our new format since it repeatedly makes tokens you can bargain. Old Stickfinger's a graveyard deck, I swear. It's going to come back back one of these days, but I feel like Mosswood Dreadnight has a chance to be very impactful in Standard, and we've mostly been talking about playing it fairly, where you're just like playing it and attacking with it and blocking with it and eventually drawing cards with it and doing it again. If you want to, you can also play this unfairly by sacrificing it, where you're sacrificing it to various like Yaras and Braids and Obnixiluses and then recasting it and doing it again. So I think Mosswood Dreadnight is just one of the best constructed cards from the set. Like, it's recursive, it's got good stats, it generates card advantage, and especially in a Standard that is super grindy, this feels like a kind of card that should be on our top 10 list of best cards from the set for the format. And apart from the fact it's green, which is like the worst color in Standard, I don't see any reason why this isn't one of the strongest cards from the set. We also got our Simic creature land in Restless Vinestalk. So, like the other ones, ETB is tapped, it makes green and blue. For 5 mana, it turns into a 5/5 green and blue plant creature token with trample, it's still a land, and when it attacks, up to one other target creature has base power and toughness of 3/3 until end of turn. That last ability is kind of neat. You can use it to like upgrade a small creature you have. Maybe you have mana dorks on the battlefield, and you can use this to turn one of those into a 3/3, get in more damage, or if your opponent only has one blocker, you can use this to downgrade it into a 3/3 to make sure your Restless Vinestalker gets in. So I think this is a powerful card. It is worth pointing out, it is expensive. Maybe the best comparison is Celestial Colonnade, which Colonnade was a legit finisher back in the day, but flying is a lot better as evasion than trample. Like, I imagine there's going to be games where this kind of gets stonewalled on the ground, even with its ability, but still, I think this card should see a decent amount of Standard play. Where it ranks in the hierarchy of this cycle, now that we've seen all of them, that's another question. I tend to lean towards the creature lands with the cheapest activation costs being the best out of this cycle, so Restless Spires and Restless Bivouac. I think that's still my number one, is Restless Bivouac. But I think that Vinestalker, because it's in Simic, and because green is pretty good at ramping, and there's a lot of ramp in this Standard, I think it still certainly has a role in Standard, and does a really nice job for finishing off the game. It is worth mentioning that the big value of these cards is we're in such a sweeper-heavy Standard that the creature lands give you a way to close out the game after your opponent farewells away your board or whatever, sun falls away your board. As far as closing out the game goes, when you already have a bunch of mana and activating it for 5 is not a big deal, this is one of the best ways of doing that. It's just the fastest clock out of any of those creature lands. So I think, much like the rest of the cycle, I expect this to see a lot of Standard play, although maybe not that much play outside of Standard. We also got a card that actually straight up shocks me that Wizards printed this, in the Irencrag. So the Irencrag, 2 mana legendary artifact, comes into play untapped. It taps to add a colorless mana, and then it says when a legendary creature enters the battlefield under your control, you can have the Irencrag become a legendary equipment artifact named Everflame Hero's Legacy. If you do, it gains Equip 3, and equipped creature gets +3/+3 and loses all other abilities. So this card is absolutely wild for a whole bunch of different reasons. So if you think about what it actually is, it's essentially a Mind Stone, a 2 mana rock that is also eventually a Volshuk Battle Gear if you want it to be. Important to point out that last ability, it is a May. You don't have to transform it into an equipment when you play a legend. You can leave it as a mana rock for as long as you want to. You never have to actually switch it over, but because this is legendary in 60 card formats, there is some value. If you want to play a full playset of these, you're going to have times when you draw multiples of them, and we have a lot of legends in Standard just incidentally. So if you ever draw 2, then you play a legend and get 1 in equipment form, even if the equipment isn't super great, like Volshuk Battle Gear, it's fine, but you're not playing this to get a equipment that's 3 to equip and gives +3/+3, but it does give you a little upside, because if you flip it into the equipment, it has a different name, and then you can play the second Irencrag from your hand. So the main reason I'm absolutely stunned this card was printed is Wizards just doesn't print 2 mana rocks in Standard. As far as I can tell, the last full true 2 mana rock in Standard was Everflowing Chalice way back in Worldwake. We're talking 2010, so what, 13, 14 years ago now? Forever ago. Wizards just doesn't do this. These cards have went the way of Birds of Paradise and Lightning Bolt. They're the cards that Wizards just doesn't print anymore because they think they're too strong. So yes, this does have a drawback that it is legendary, which we talked about that is a bit of a downside, but still, this does some really scary things in Standard that other cards don't do. So we have Sheoldred, of course. My first thought when I saw this is, oh my god, now Sheoldred can come down on turn 3. That's gonna be super fun. But if you think about the ramp curve of Standard, Irencrag on turn 2 gets you to Invasion of Zendikar on turn 3, which gets you to either a Atraxa or a Tally on turn 4. That is a full turn faster than the Topiary Stomper plan that we see decks using now. So I think this card is worth it. I think this will have an impact on Standard. Yeah, there's going to be some clunkiness with it, you know, being legendary and you're drawing too many copies, but maybe you just play 2 or 3 of them, or worst case, if you're ramping into a Atraxa or a Tally, you generate so much card advantage. Do you actually care if you have a dead card as an extra legend? Plus the get around the legend rule by flipping into an equipment anyway. The other place this card is absolutely ridiculous is in Commander. So in Commander, 2 mana rocks are some of the best cards and most heavily played cards in the format. And this is not only a new 2 mana rock, it's actually a very good 2 mana rock. Not only are you ramping starting on turn 2, but eventually you turn into an equipment, which is a nice little bonus, especially if you're playing an equipment deck. If you're playing an equipment deck and you have equipment synergies, having a mana rock that ramps you in the early game, but in the late game when you have enough mana, don't really need it, turns into a not great but still existing equipment, seems really, really powerful. So I would be very surprised if a year from now, 2 years from now, when you look at EDH Rec and just look at the most played colorless cards, I would be shocked if this card was not in the like top 10 maybe. The only complaint I have about this card, and I think this is kind of a big one, it is a rare. In the past when we've seen these mana rocks, they're traditionally commons, and I know this has upside, it's got flavor, it turns into an equipment, but still, if this is really heavily played in Commander, it has a chance to be kind of expensive because it is printed at rare rather than at a lower rarity like these other cards. But the Irencrag, I'm still surprised that this card exists in all honesty. I was not expecting a 2 mana rock. I had given up on Wizard ever putting a 2 mana rock in Standard again, and even with the restriction of being legendary, I think this card is pretty exciting and gonna have an impact in Standard. Back in Pioneer, which also doesn't have 2 mana rocks, if you want to ramp into your Karn turn early and you're not playing, mono green or whatever, this is a way you can do that. It works with Paradox Engine combos, which are kind of popular right now because of the One Ring, plus it's gonna be a Commander All-Star. So the Irencrag, just a really good card that I'm still very surprised is a real Magic the Gathering card. Next up, we have a new 3-drop green creature in Sentinel of Lost Lore. So 3 mana 3/4 Elf Knight. When it enters a battlefield, you choose one or more of return target card you own in exile that has an adventure to your hand. Put target card you don't own in exile that has an adventure on the bottom of its owner's library, or exile target player's graveyard, which is kind of the odd ability out in that one. The first two are like very narrow, specific to adventures. The last one I think is designed to give the card relevance in more matchups. If it was just the first two abilities, if your opponent's not playing adventures and you're not playing adventures, kind of doesn't really do anything except be a creature. Exiling the graveyard, though, is something that is often going to have at least some value. So Sentinel of Lost Lore, we start off with a 3 mana 3/4, which kind of reminds me of Godric yesterday, the 3 mana 3/3 haster in red, where we talked about how like a decade ago, just being a 3 mana 3/3 with haste was a good enough set of stats and abilities that a card would see play just based on rate. I feel like 3 mana 3/4s are kind of the same. Like a decade ago, Rox Warmonk was legitimately showing up in like legacy decks as a 3 mana 3/4 lifelinker, but today we have like Cemetery Prowler, a 3 mana 3/4 that ramps you and exile stuff from the graveyard and has vigilance and all this stuff, and it doesn't even really see play. So all this to say, we no longer live in a world where a 3 mana 3/4 just kind of like makes your draw drop and you're like, wow, that's so above the curve. It's no longer 2009 Shards of Valera Rox Warmonk era. So I think a 3 mana 3/4 is fine, but to really make it, it's gonna have to make it based on its abilities. These abilities are pretty strong, but they're only strong in a pretty narrow set of circumstances, especially the first two. So the first ability lets you put an adventure card that you had already cast the adventure mode of and is in exile back in your hand. So essentially, maybe you Balloona and you mill some cards and fill your hand with adventures, and you're like, well, rather than paying Balloona as a creature, I would rather cast Seek Thrills again. So you can Sentinels of Lost Lore, put Balloona back in your hand, cast adventure mode again. There's some cool synergy with like Beanstalk Worm. Imagine like turn 2 you plant beans to make an extra land drop. Turn 3 you can Sentinel of Lost Lore to put Beanstalk Worm back in your hand and then make another extra land drop. Or like like Kellen for multiple tutors. So if you're playing an adventure deck and you're really interested in reusing the spell mode of your adventures, then I think Sentinel of Lost Lore is pretty good. It also is kind of a weird hate card for your opponent's adventures. Basically, take what I was just saying, but in reverse. So your opponent like balloonas and mills some cards and draws some cards with their adventures, and then you don't want your opponent to have a 4/4 trample or ramp spell on the battlefield. So you Sentinel and you choose to put Balluna on the bottom of your opponent's deck so they don't get the creature mode. Or your opponent Kellens to tutor up an equipment, but you don't really want to deal with a 2/2 double striker. So Sentinel could put Kellen back in your opponent's deck. So both of those abilities are strong, but they're really only strong if you're playing adventures or your opponent's playing adventures. So it's really dependent on how often are we going to see adventures in standard. That's what's going to determine if this card makes it. The other mode is maybe the most interesting. Endurance is kind of like one of the best cards in Modern right now as a 3-mana 3/4 that can deal with someone's graveyard. Endurance though can also be evoked, and it has reach, and it has flash, so it has a lot of things going for it. I'm not saying this is endurance by any stretch, but this could be standard legal endurance. Like if you're worried about your opponent going off with Tenacious Underdogs and Razorlash Transmogrants, if you're worried about them reanimating Atraxa with Cruelty of Gex, if the control deck's about to flashback Memory Deluge, being able to just play a relatively on-curve creature that nukes your opponent's graveyard, that actually has some value. I don't know if that's enough to actually like make me want to play this in my main deck, unless I'm an adventure deck. If I'm also an adventure deck and getting extra value out of my adventures, then I could become excited about this card. This could also maybe see some weird play in older formats. In older formats, I'm most interested in like Fae of Wishes with Lucky Clover to tutor from your sideboard, and then Sentinel to get back to Fae of Wishes to tutor from your sideboard again without discarding cards and risking it on the battlefield. So maybe that could be a thing in some sort of adventure deck. Not that like adventures are super competitive outside of standard. So Sentinel of Lost Lore, I like this card. The Graveyard Hate mode, I think, keeps it relevant in Standard if adventures are bad, as a sideboard card for green decks, for elf decks. 3-mana 3/4, again, not groundbreaking in 2023, but good enough stats that you're not going to be embarrassed to have this in your sideboard. And then if you're an adventure deck, or you run into an adventure deck, this is a very powerful option. It seems like a nice safety valve for what happened last time. Remember last time how adventures were just like kind of dominant in Standard? I feel like Wizards has learned from that lesson, and they're like, okay, we're actually going to print some pretty reasonable sideboard hate for adventures this time around. So if we end up in a world where adventures are really good again, then the value of Sentinel of Lost Lore goes way up, because it's a really nice hate card for your opponent's adventure deck, while also being good in your adventure deck. Plus you get the Graveyard Hate as a bonus. We also got, speaking of adventures that you can hate on with Sentinel and Lost Lore, Devouring Sugarmaw. So Devouring Sugarmaw, it's an Orzhov rare adventure creature. It's spell side, 2 mana, it's white, it's an instant, and it says create a 1/1 white human creature token and a food token. So 2 tokens on the battlefield for 2 mana, not horrible in instant speed. And then its creature side is a 4 mana 6/6 with menace and trample. But at the beginning of your upkeep, you have to sack an artifact, enchantment, or token, so basically the bargain types. And if you don't, you have to tap Devouring Sugarmaw. So Devouring Sugarmaw, this card is kind of interesting. Its spell half, I guess the closest comparison is kind of like Tough Cookie. Tough Cookie, a 2/2 that makes a food when it comes into play for 2 mana. You're getting a slightly smaller creature, but you get to do it at instant speed, which has some upside. So the spell half is fine, especially if you actively care about having tokens on the battlefield, food on the battlefield. Plus, it helps support the Sugarmaw. I think that's the main idea. You cast this adventure side, and then when you play the creature side, you should have those 2 tokens on the battlefield to let you keep your Sugarmaw untapped and attacking for at least a couple of turns. The creature side, it reminds me of a lot of old demons we have in Magic, where like they're powerful and kind of above the curve, but if you don't sack something on your upkeep, you're gonna have to tap them, and they're not actually gonna be helpful on offense. So I think that Devouring Sugarmaw, it's way better than a lot of the old demons, most of which require you sacking like creatures, which is way more painful than artifact, enchantment, or token. Tokens are very easy to sacrifice, so I think that Devouring Sugarmaw could definitely have a role in Standard. The first thing I thought of is this is another really good fight rigging creature. Like in the early game, you make a 1/1 to keep your life total high, then you get down to your fight rigging, and then turn 4, you can Sugarmaw, go to combat, make it 7 power, cast your free thing. So at a minimum, this seems like another ideal creature to work with fight rigging. And in a fight rigging deck, like even if you got gotta tap down your Sugarmaw sometimes? Do you really care if you're triggering your fight rigging and casting some big game-ending threat to close out the game quickly? Probably not really. It also kind of compares to Archfiend of Dross. We now have 2 4-mana 6/6s in Standard that each have drawbacks, but maybe there can just be some sort of weird stompy deck where you're just like, okay, I'm gonna play these super above the curve evasive creatures. Yeah, they got drawbacks. Yeah, I might die to my own Archfiend sometimes. Yeah, I might have to tap my Sugarmaw sometimes. But when things work out, I just add so much power to the battlefield so quickly, I'm just gonna smash it to death in a couple of turns and close out the game. The tokens also suggest this being a good option for bargain style decks. So you're getting 2 tokens, which of course you can sacrifice to Devouring Sugarmaw, but you could also sack to like back for seconds, which works really well with Sugarmaw. Like you can sacrifice one of the tokens to get back a Sugarmaw from your graveyard and another card to your hand. Works with Realm Scorcher, Hellkite, another card for that stompy deck. If you're just gonna be like, okay, I'm gonna play above the curve evasive things, you play Sugarmaw, you play the Realm Scorcher, sacking one of the tokens, you just have so much power on the battlefield. Beseech the Mirror, of course, just a super busted tutor. The only downside I see of this card is the creature side is susceptible to removal, and if you just look at the top tiers of Standard right now, it's very removal heavy. It's like Dimir mid-rangey control, Esper control, mono black kind of aggro-y, lots of removal control. So all the decks you're going to play against are going to have a bunch of removal spells that can kill Sugarmaw. The Adventure side does help here, so as long as you cast the Adventure side first, at least you're getting some value out of it. And then even if your Sugarmaw does die, like obviously it's not ideal, but it still might be worth the risk. The other issue is this is kind of directly competing with Sheoldred, and that might be the biggest problem I think with Sugarmaw. Like if you're going to spend 4 mana and you're playing a black deck, wouldn't you rather just cast Sheoldred even if Sugarmaw is a little bit bigger and has some cool synergies going on? So maybe this is a card for specific decks. Like if you're a bargain deck, maybe this is better. If you're a food themed deck and you have kind of ways to take advantage of having food tokens on the battlefield or a token deck, maybe this beats out Sheoldred there. But in a generic sense, I feel like even though Devouring Sugarmaw does have some upsides like Trample and Menace, the downside is it's not Sheoldred, and Sheoldred is just one of the best 4-drops we've seen in Standard in a long time. So I'm afraid this is one of those cards that might be when Sheoldred rotates it gets a chance to shine. But in the short term at least, if you're a deck that can really take advantage of the tokens or like the fight rigging synergy, that's where Devouring Sugarmaw could really have an immediate impact. We also got a really weird new 1-drop Faerie in Sleep Curse Faerie. So Sleep Curse Faerie, 1 mana 3/3 Flying War 2 Fairy Wizard, starts off sounding really good, but it ETB's tapped with 3 stun counters on it. And a stun counter means if it would become untapped, instead you remove a stun counter from it, but it does have pay 1 and a blue to untap it. So when you first read this card, you're like, oh my god, this card's ridiculous. It's like a better Delver. This is a Delver that's already flipped and has Ward 2. The problem is those stun counters. If you actually think through those stun counters, let's say you're playing this fairly. You play this on turn 1, it has those 3 stun counters. On turn 2, you remove a stun counter. Turn 3, you remove a stun counter. Turn 4, you remove a stun counter. Turn 5, it finally untaps and turns into a real creature. An upgraded Delver of Secrets on turn 5? Not actually very exciting. That's just way too slow. Let's say you want to dump some mana into its untap ability. So 2 mana to untap it. You play it on turn 1. Turn 2, instead of doing magic-y things, you just spend your 2 mana to untap it, which is to remove a stun counter. So now you're down to 1 stun counter. Turn 3, you remove the last stun counter, and then you can pay 2 more mana, finally untap it. So you can get this to untap by turn 3, but then you have a 5 mana, if you include all the untapping mana, a 5 mana 3/3 Flying Ward 2, which is okay, I guess, but still not exciting and requires you to mostly skip turn 2 and turn 3. So when you add all this together, I actually think that Sleep Curse Faerie is pretty bad as a creature. If you're playing this to attack and block and do creaturey things, I think it's not a very good card, but there's 2 reasons I'm actually really hyped for this card. One is, we've seen the theme of fairies in Wilds of Eldraine be, I just really want a fairy on the battlefield, because if I can have a fairy on the battlefield, then all of a sudden, fairy fencing becomes great removal. Ego Drain becomes a better Thoughtseize. Spell Stutter turns into a better mana leak. So I feel like just having a fairy on the battlefield is so important to fairies that maybe this weird fairy that doesn't actually untap for a bunch of turns is enough just because it costs 1 mana and turns on all these cards. The other reason I'm really hyped for this is we've seen creatures that can untap themselves be absurd combo pieces. A classic example is Horseshoe Crab, a horrible creature, a 3-mana 1/3, but it's 1 blue mana to untap it. There's a lot of ways you can use this to go infinite. So one easy example is you put an equipment like Heavy Arbalist on it that lets the creature tap to deal damage, and then you can like tap your creature to deal 2 damage to something, and then pay 2 and untap it and do it again and do it again. Not a great combo, but repeatable shock for 2 mana. But it gets even better than that. The best combos are infinite mana style combos, often involving like Experiment Craj. Experiment Craj gets all the abilities of all creatures with +1/+1 counters. So if you can give Experiment Craj Sleep Curse Fairy's ability to pay 2 and untap it, and also like Incubation Druid's ability of tap to add 3 mana, you just make infinite mana. You tap your Experiment Craj like Incubation Druid to make 3, then pay 2 to untap it with Sleep Curse Fairy's ability. And we can actually do this in Standard thanks to Agatha's Soul Cauldron in Cami of Whispered Hope. So Agatha's Soul Cauldron kind of does the Experiment Craj thing. Creatures with +1/+1 counters have all the activated abilities of all creatures that are exiled with it. So what we need to do to go off is get a Cami of Whispered Hopes in the graveyard, a creature with an ability of tap to add X mana of any one color where X is its power, get it in the graveyard, exile it with Soul Cauldron. By tapping it, put the counter on Sleep Curse Fairy to give Sleep Curse Fairy the Cami's ability, and then we just go infinite. Assuming we have no stun counters, we do got to get around those, but our Faerie would be a 4-power creature thanks to the counter from Agatha's Soul Cauldron, so we can tap it to add 4 mana thanks to Cami of Whispered Hopes, untap it for 2 mana, do it again, do it again, do it again, make infinite mana, use that mana to win the game. So that's why I'm hyped about this card. I think as a creature it's pretty lackluster because of those stun counters, but as a combo piece or as a Faerie synergy piece, this card can actually do some really cool things and actually is bringing infinite mana combo back to Standard for the first time in a while. Speaking of 1 mana blue creatures, we also got Elusive Otter, a 1 mana 1/1 prowess creature that says creatures with power less than its power can't block it, and then its sorcery side, Grove's Bounty, green and X, distribute X +1/+1 counters among any number of target creatures you control. So this card I think is actually also very strong. I was surprised to find there is not a card that works like Grove's Bounty in Magic. There's nothing that's just like, hey, put X +1/+1 counters on things. So that by itself is pretty intriguing, even at sorcery speed. And then the creature side, it's kind of like a Blister Coil Weird, essentially. Maybe better than that, because Prowess is better than Blister Coil Weird's ability. But there's not that many 1 mana Prowess creatures, and we've seen in the past, just being 1 mana and having Prowess is often enough to make a creature good. And this is even better because not only is this a cheap prowess creature, it's also a spell. And if you're playing a prowess style deck, what do you need? You need creatures with prowess and then spells to trigger them. So Elusive Otter is both of those in one, which is a really powerful package. So I don't think this really has a shot once you get back to Modern, because it does have 1 toughness, and 1 toughness creatures are just in a really rough spot thanks to Orcish Bowmasters and Wrenn and 6. But in Standard or Pioneer or Explorer, I actually think this card could be really good. It combines really well with another new card, another card that I think's one of the strongest adventures in the set, which is Questing Druid. Questing Druid, its creature side, 2 mana 1/1, whenever you cast a spell that's white, blue, black, or red, put a +1/+1 counter on it, like a Quirion Druid essentially. Its spell side, 1 in a red instant, exile the top 2 cards of your library. Until your next end step, you may play those cards. So I could see these cards working really well together. These are 2 cheap creatures that want you to sling a bunch of spells that also happen to be spells. So you get both. You get the payoff and the support card all in one, which is a ridiculous package. So I really want to try building some sort of like Teamer Prowess Miracle Grow deck with both of these cards, where you can play your Belmore and Swiftspear, and then have your Questing Druids and your Elusive Otters be your support cards and also your payoff cards. And one of the things I've noticed trying to build prowess in Standard is there's this really delicate balance. You need a bunch of spells or your deck doesn't work because you can't trigger your prowess abilities, but you also need enough creatures that you have threats on the battlefield, or else you're casting all these consider type spells that aren't really doing much because you have nothing to trigger with them. I love the fact that these adventure creatures are both in one, so we'll see how good this deck ends up being. I mean, we are building around a bunch of 1/1s, but I do think there's enough synergy here, and these cards are powerful enough that it could create a brand new archetype. There's also some extra synergy, like the +1/+1 counters works really well with Hardened Scales. We're just talking about Agatha's Soul Cauldron, how it needs creatures to have +1/+1 counters on it. If you want to give all your creatures an activated ability, then Grove's Bounty is actually the best way in Magic, or at least in Standard, I think, think, to just put a bunch of counters on your stuff and start your combos and your synergies. I think there's also a chance that this could work in Pioneer. So in Pioneer, we've seen prowess be strong. You got Soulscar Mage, you got Monastery Swiftspear. Elusive Otter seems to fit right in that package. The same thing we were talking about in Standard. Being an on-curve prowess creature, but also a spell to trigger your prowess creatures is just so good. The only problem is, most of these decks are, is it going to be worth splashing into green for the adventure side? I think the answer might be yes. I think that Elusive Otter is good enough, and the fact that you can get a spell out of your creature is strong enough that maybe we see like Teamer Prowess emerge in a format like Pioneer as well. So Elusive Otter, the card's kind of ridiculous. Don't sleep on these cheap adventure creatures. We saw them be so good last time with Brazen Borrower and Lovestruck Beast and Bone Crusher Giant. I think that Elusive Otter and some of the adventure cards we've seen in the last day are the cards that can have a huge impact on Standard. They look really fun though. I'm not really worried about them being devastating like some of the original adventures were, but I think these cards can be very, very strong and playable. We also got a really wonky red enchantment in Food Fight. So Food Fight, 2 mana red enchantment, says artifacts you control have pay 2, sack it. It deals damage to any target equal to 1 plus the number of permanents named Food Fight you control. So essentially, with just a single Food Fight on the battlefield, all your artifacts have pay 2, deal 2 damage to anything. If somehow you get 2 or 3 Food Fights on the battlefield, then all your artifacts become super duper scary. So Food Fight, I'm actually not sure what to think about this card. Is this card like a legit game-breaking option to close out games if you make a bunch of artifacts and just dump all your mana into throwing them at your opponent's face? It is only 2 mana, but it also kind of looks like a meme card or even an unset card or an against the odds card. So I am not sure how to evaluate this card. I will say, we've seen P and Karen Nalaar in the past, and the comparison's not perfect because P and Karen Nalaar also put 4 power and 3 bodies on the battlefield, but we've seen P and Karen Nalaar, which is pay 3, sack an artifact, deals 2 damage to any target. We've seen that ability close out a lot of games, and Food Fight is actually more efficient. Of course, you're not getting the bodies on the battlefield, but just when it comes to sacking artifacts for damage, Food Fight does it better than P and Karen Nalaar. If you want to go really deep on this card, and this is probably the against the odds mode, we do have stuff like Calyx, Yenna, Sea Double that can just make multiple copies of Food Fight. Obviously, you can draw more than one, which would be great, but if you only draw one, maybe you copy it a few times, and if you get to the point where each artifact you sacrifice is dealing like 4 damage, then I have no doubt this is a ridiculous finisher. We do have a lot of support for this in Standard. We've talked about this throughout spoiler season, but our current Standard is plentiful with cheap artifact tokens that are sacrificable, blood tokens, treasure tokens, now a bunch of food tokens. So I could certainly imagine a deck where you just flood the board with these tokens and then use Food Fight to kill your opponent in like 1 or 2 turns. It also synergizes hilariously with Sir Ginger. I guess maybe that's part of the flavor of the card, but Sir Ginger wants artifacts going into the graveyard, so as you sack them, it's also growing your Sir Ginger and scrying through your deck. This could maybe be really good in the Oni called Anvil decks. These decks used to be really powerful in Standard, but they've sort of fallen away recently, but I imagine Food Fight could be a nice addition. Oni called Anvil just wants you to be sacrificing artifacts to make more construct tokens. Food Fight gives you some damage, so you can use it to shoot down creatures or just close out the game, so that seems like an easy home there as well. There's also some sneaky synergies with artifacts making mana, like Knight of Sweet's Revenge lets your food tap to make mana. So if you make a bunch of food and your food tap for mana, you can tap your food for mana and then sack them to Food Fight, because the artifacts to Food Fight don't need to tap, they just sacrifice. So essentially with Knight of Sweet's Revenge, all your food are 1 mana sacrifice it to deal 2 damage, so you can tap them for mana first. You can also use Power Stones to do the same trick. Power Stones, we used to make fun of them because they only make mana for artifacts or abilities. Well, Food Fight's an ability, so if you have some Power Stones on the battlefield, just like the food with Knight of Sweet's Revenge, it's kinda pay 1 sacrifice to deal 2 damage, so maybe there's a deck that just makes a bunch of food or a bunch of Power Stones, and Food Fight's the finisher to close it out. Once you get back to Commander, also pretty good with Zerta, just reducing the cost. The cheaper you can make this, the better it's gonna be, so Food Fight, I love this card. I think this card's really funny. I just don't know if it's good or not. I'm still really on the fence as to whether this is like an all-star standard card or a sideboard finisher for certain decks, or if it's just a full-on against the odds meme style card. I don't know if it's like the text on the card that's confusing me, or if it's the flavor, just like Food Fight. It feels so much like an unset card. The art, the name, everything about it feels like an unset card, but I can't shake the feeling that this card might actually have a home in standard, and in the right deck, it might be pretty good, and I'm definitely going to build a deck to try to make it work. Rounding out our rares, and also some uncommons for the day, we got a bunch of Jumpstart cards that aren't actually Jumpstart cards because they're not doing set-specific Jumpstart for Wilds of Eldraine. So these cards were going to be in Wilds of Eldraine Jumpstart. You might remember the story of Jumpstart. Wizards made Jumpstart. Everyone loved it. It was super cool, one of the best sets of the year. And then Wizards was like, people really like this. So what if we do it every single set? And they started doing every set, but it was really bad and watered down and no one liked it anymore. So apparently they're moving away from doing Jumpstart every set, which makes sense because I literally know no one who buys Jumpstart boosters for the set specific ones. But these cards were going to be in Wilds of Eldraine Jumpstart, but then they pulled the plug on Wilds of Eldraine Jumpstart. So these cards will be standard legal. They're not showing up in draft boosters, but I believe they'll be in set and collector boosters. And these cards, like most set specific Jumpstart cards, aren't really designed to be super competitive. Like, most of them I think are a little bit too much mana to really see play, but they got some cool flavors, so you can check them all out over on MTGPreviews.com. The one I actually am a little excited about is Malevolent Witchkite, which is a 6-mana 5/4 flying dragon warlock. This is when an ETBs you can sack any number of artifacts, enchantments, or tokens and draw that many cards. We've talked many times through this spoiler season about how it's really easy to make artifact tokens in standard between food tokens, blood tokens, treasure tokens. In 6 mana for a 5/4 flyer, the ETB sacks like 3 or 4 tokens and refills your hand. That actually seems kind of reasonable. It is very bad against Sheoldred. If you're drawing a ton of cards, Sheoldred's gonna kill ya, but discounting the Sheoldred problem, I could actually see a deck that would want this card. But the rest of them, I think, are mostly just random casual cards that are intentionally underpowered and not in draft boosters, but they are standard legal if you want to build around them. Finally today, we got a bunch of Commander cards. So Commander precons come out tomorrow, but we got this set booster Commander cards today, and Tomer is doing a video showing off these cards over on the MTGGoldfish Commander YouTube. So I'm not going to get into these. There's these and a bunch more, but I want to tell you that Tomer's doing the video. You should check him out. I did want to mention real quick, though, Throne of Eldraine, I absolutely love this design. 5-mana legendary artifact, ETBs, choose a color, add 4 mana of the chosen color, but spend it only to cast monocolored spells of that color, and then pay 3, tap it, draw 2 cards, but spend only mana of the chosen color to activate this ability. So one thing I've noticed about Commander, and you can even see this right now in the cards on screen, is the format tends to be 3 to 5 color soup decks. If you just look at the most popular Commanders on EDH Rec, they are mostly 2, 3, 4, 5 colors, with 5 color being very overrepresented because people just want to play all the sweet things. And that's fine. I also love playing 5 color decks in Commander, but I wish we could see more monocolored decks in Commander and it wasn't so much 5 color play all the good card decks. And I feel like cards like Throne of Eldraine, which is kind of ridiculous. Like, this comes down for 5 mana, immediately makes back 4, and gives you card advantage throughout the game. That's a really, really strong card, but more cards like this that are designed to prop up monocolor decks. Throne of Eldraine is a card that in a monocolor deck is going to be an all-star. It's so good, but in a 2-color deck even, you're probably not going to play it. It's going to be way too clunky. So I just want to shout out Wizards and say how much I love that design, and I hope we see more of these designs that are intentionally made to make monocolor just a little bit better in Commander and push us a little bit away from that 5-color pile that we see so often. In the world of lower rarity cards, got a handful I wanted to mention individually, starting with Eriette's Tempting Apple. So 4 mana legendary food artifact. When it ETBs, you gain control of target creature until end of turn. Untap it, it gains haste until end of turn. And then you can pay 2 to sacrifice it to gain 3, or pay 2 to sacrifice it to have target opponent lose 3. So I'm not exactly sure what this has to do with Eriette, which is all about like putting auras on things. I guess the Drain is a little bit like Eriette. But I feel like being an expensive but colorless threat-in is interesting. That's just something we haven't really seen before. So this is something that you can play it, steal your opponent's best creature, maybe sacrifice it to something, and then you kind of get like either half of a lightning helix while it's sitting on the battlefield. It's also possible in the right deck that you could blink this repeatedly to just keep stealing a creature of your opponent's every turn and then sacrificing it to whatever. So I feel like Eriette's Tempting Apple, mostly interesting just because being a colorless threaten is kind of unique. We usually see threatens be spells that are red, not artifacts that sit on the battlefield and are colorless, so I don't think this card's busted or anything, but I do think it could have uses in some sort of like steal and sacrifice style deck. We also got a bunch of new Faerie stuff, starting with a new uncommon Faerie adventure in Picklock Prankster. So creature side, 2 mana, 1/3 Flying Vigilance, not very exciting, but its spell side is intriguing. 2 mana instant, mill 4 cards and put an instant sorcery or fairy from among the milled cards into your hand. So this seems like kind of a fine way to fill your graveyard. We've seen Merfolk Secret Keeper see play is a way to fill your graveyard. This is 1 more mana, but you get the upside of actually drawing a card. Merfolk Secret Keeper is cheaper and sorcery, but it's just put cards in your graveyard. This is put cards in your graveyard and then get back an instant sorcery or fairy, so that could have some uses. We also got Spellscorn Coven, which is going to be an interesting test of just how strong adventures are. So it curves the way you want an adventure to curve. If you look at the strongest adventures from the past, like Bone Crusher or Brazen Borrower, their spells curve into their creature halves, and that's what Spellscorn Coven does. However, both of the effects on this card are probably overcosted by like 1 mana, the adventure tax. So its spell side is 2 and a blue, instant, return target spell to its owner's hand, and then its creature side is a 4 mana 2/3 black Flying Faerie Warlock. This says when it enters the battlefield, each opponent discards a card. So in theory, on turn 3, you bounce whatever your opponent plays, and you can untap on turn 4 and run out the creature side, make your opponent discard. That doesn't seem horrible, although comparing it to other similar options, Unsubstantiate bounces a spell or a creature for 2 mana at instant speed. Liliana Spectre is a 2-power flyer that makes each opponent discard a card, and it's only 3 mana. So I'm not sure what to make of this card. It could have relevance in some sort of Faerie Stempo style deck. It does curve the way the most powerful adventures do, but at the same time, both halves do feel a little bit overcosted compared to what I'd want. Speaking of Faerie cards, we did get a pretty good one in Spell Stutter. So 2 mana instant, counter target spell unless its controller pays 2, plus an additional 1 for each Faerie you control. So this reminds me a lot of Make Disappear, the dominant force as far as counter spells in current standard, where for 2 mana, you counter a spell unless its controller pays 2. So in the early game, on turn 2, this is just going to stop your opponent's play, but then later in the game, it powers itself up. Make Disappear by sacking something to casualty, Spell Stutter just by having fairies on the battlefield. So if you have 1 fairy, it turns into Mana Leak. If you have 2 fairies, your opponent's probably never paying for it. If you got a big board full of fairies, it's essentially a counter spell that's easier to cast. So if we see a deck that's all about adding a ton of fairies to the battlefield, this could beat out Make Disappear, or at least show up alongside Make Disappear in the counter suite. We also got a cheeky little 1-drop in Cheeky House Mouse. So this is another adventure card. Its mouse side is a Savannah Lions, 1 mana for a 2/1 vanilla creature. Its spell side, Squeak By, 1 mana sorcery, target creature you control gets +1/+N until end of turn, and it can't be blocked by creatures with power 3 or greater this turn. So you sneak in for some damage and then play a Savannah Lions. I think this card's fine. Like, if you're trying to be aggro, a Savannah Lions is still a pretty reasonable threat, although it is also kind of a hilarious example of power creep. Back in Alpha, a literal lion had these stats. Now in 2023, mice are apparently as strong as lions, so I don't know about the flavor of this card when you look at it in a historical context, but if you want to be aggressive, the mouse is a fine option for your white aggro deck. We also got, of course, a bunch of lower rarity stuff you can check out over on MTGpreviews.com. A couple of sweet lower rarity previews. Gingerbrew, actually a pretty good 1 mana 1/1. Disdainful Stroke, always good to have around in Standard, as much as a lot of cards in this set seem to support Shieldred. Disdainful Stroke, actually one of the cleanest answers to Shieldred in Standard. Last but not least, we got our Enchanting Tales for today. So really not a ton to see here. The couple of non-English cards, one is Vampiric Rites, just 1 mana, sack a creature, draw 2 cards. The blue one is the blue Leyline that gives everything flash. I will say that As Foretold Animator does look really sweet, but these cards already exist on Arena. They're just, some cool reprints with neat art. We did get a few new to Arena cards. Blind Obedience, pretty good if you want to just slow your opponent down by making their stuff be tapped. Hatching Plans, kind of a weird challenge card. 2-mana enchantment. When it goes to the graveyard from the battlefield, you draw 3 cards. So if you have some sort of sacrifice enchantment deck, this could be your Ancestral Recall almost. And then Compulsion, that's another card that I think is mostly for Commander. Just a lot of little value, discarding cards to draw a card, sacrificing it to draw a card. So if you want to rummage through your deck and fill your graveyard, it does get the job done. Anyway, that brings us to the end of our Wilds of Eldraine spoilers for today. So thanks so much for watching, everyone. I hope you enjoyed it. And one more reminder, check out Tomer's video on the Commander YouTube with all the sweet new Commander cards. So I'll be back tomorrow with more Wilds of Eldraine spoilers. Until then, have an amazing day, and I will talk to you soon. Looking for even more magic? Well, check out the video where we tried to see if you could win on Arena with a 0 rare budget with the help of Shrapnel Blast, or maybe the one where we talked about the most expensive card from every year of Magic the Gathering.